I was playing outside, and then my mother calls me. Nasi ndoro tenga chingwa. Today, you are going to buy bread. Ndega. Alone. I had never been to the stores to buy anything of consequence alone. The only time I've been to the stores to buy anything of consequence was when I would take along when my mother would send my older cousins. I was my mother's last-born baby, and still am. And as most of you know, last-born babies rarely lift a finger in the home, especially in the home. Hence my sharp ndega. There was no way I was going to go to the bread queue alone. But one thing you don't do is make an African mother repeat herself after giving an instruction. I knew I had to comply. So my older cousins had already been sent to the stores to buy other items, because usually the things that we would buy during this period will come on different days. But on this particular day, everything was just available all at once. So it was kind of a divide and conquer situation. Hence, I was home alone and was sent to go, to the bread queue. Being an 8-year-old Zimbabwean, I was convinced that Zimbabweans loved to stand in a queue. We used to queue to get into the bus. We used to queue to get into the bank. I even remember starting grade 1, I stood in a queue to get in class. Yeah. So this was the year 2008, or Gorenzara, the year of hunger, as most local Zimbabweans like to call it. And I know you days, you're saying it's giving Zimbabwe. If it ever gave Zimbabwe, that time in 2008, that's when it was really giving Zimbabwe. Yeah. So it's 2008, and things are really tough. The inflation in the country, is so high that my advice to anyone in this room who wants to be a billionaire, just look for $100 Zimbabwean dollar bill from that time. You can be a billionaire right then, but you'll be a poor billionaire. That's how terrible, things were at that time. So it's 2008. I didn't want to go to the bread queue, but, African mothers being African mothers, shortly I was at the bread queue. So I was in grade 3, and I'd always been short for someone in grade 3. And I remember this distinctly because whilst I was standing in the queue, my face was digging into some woman's behind. And I was so glad that the person who was standing behind me was an age mate and not another towering figure that would probably squash me in the stampede that usually forms when the bakery doors open. Because, believe it or not, us standing in the queue was just to show who had gotten there first. It had nothing to do whatsoever with who would get the bread first. So, we are standing in the queue, and I turn around, start chatting with a mate who was standing behind me. And our conversation was that, remember that time you sleep with one eye open? Because although we're talking to each other, chit-chatting and all that, our focus was on the bakery doors and how to find ourselves at the front of the queue once those bakery doors open. And at this time, I was holding a paper bag with cash, and it's getting heavier and heavier. That was really a lot of money, physically, but not in terms of value. So I'm there with my paper bag, and at this point I just think, maybe I should just go back home. But that thought leaves my mind instantly, because I thought I didn't want to be the one to come back home empty-handed, since my cousins were already waiting for other things in other queues. So with my friend, we are there, we are waiting, and we are chit-chatting. This was such a huge crowd. It seemed as if everyone in our community had sent a special envoy on a bread-finding mission, because it was such a huge crowd. So we waited and waited and waited and waited. We really waited. Finally, the bakery doors open, and now everyone is trying to push to the front, just like I had predicted. Now everyone is trying to push to the front to get a loaf of bread. And then, 8-year-old me is also trying, in the crowd to push to the front. I get the front. I try to stretch my 8-year-old hand to get the bread, but it's not doing any mission. So I'm being pushed, I'm being shoved. I even remember being elbowed. That was tough times. And, I managed to maneuver, and finally I got, a loaf of bread. And then I moved over to the designated payment point. I was so relieved, emotionally and physically. Physically, because I paid for the bread, so the paper bag wasn't heavy anymore. And emotionally, if anyone was going to come home empty-handed, it was definitely not going to be me. So I was super proud of what I had done. And, I moved from paying for the bread. Now I'm just clinging on it and holding it by the neck so that it doesn't run away. And I'm feeling so proud of myself, because this is something that I didn't even want to do in the morning. And look at me now. I had gotten the bread. I couldn't wait to go home and show everyone that, I had gotten the bread. And now I'm pacing and walking home. And a thought hits me, and I think, is it always this satisfying to be a provider? Is it always this satisfying, to fight for something to help your family survive and make it, Is it always this satisfying, Because now I was imagining going home and watching everyone eating their bread and be like, yeah, I did that. So I just thought, is it always this satisfying, to be a provider? Is this how really it feels? And now I'm pacing home, and I also think to myself, at dawn, I had left home just an 8-year-old boy. But now at dusk, as I was walking home with my bread in hand, it's now at dusk, just to show you the amount of time I'd waited in the queue. And I'm walking home with my bread in hand, and I was really a breadwinner, Like literally. Thank you.